Hey everyone, in this video I want to summarize the interview Talkative Tri had with Jonathan yesterday. I will cover main talking points, sometimes add some SSF flavor, and at the end also talk about Talkative Tri and his interview style. Let's dive in. The first topic is changing project management by focusing no longer on locked features, but instead on locked dates. Apparently, as we learn, what happened in Path of Exile 2 compared to Path of Exile 1 in terms of project planning is that they decided to lock in features for a release rather than the timeline. The result of this is that you guarantee the content that you release, but you can't guarantee the timeline. As someone working on complex IT projects myself, this is a strategy, but it's quite dangerous to work without set timelines, without deadlines, and you should only do this, in my opinion and in my experience, if the features or content or change you're doing must be shipped in one package, for example because of regulatory requirements. As far as I know, that's not the case with Path of Exile. There is no need to go this route, there's no need to lock in features, and Jonathan explains they'll be going back to locking in the date instead, like they did in Path of Exile 1, where it worked quite well, historically. This achieves two things, I believe. One, hopefully at least, we will get more consistent release cycles, albeit with likely less content per league. They're aiming for 4 months per game, which is still going to be a humongous task, I feel. Two, by having a timeline, you create a healthy pressure within the team working on it, that there is a deadline and that has psychological consequences. And I don't mean sort of top-down induced crunch. I mean that if people start to internalize a release date, they start acting differently and start making decisions with that date in mind. All the nice-to-have requirements, or features as Jonathan calls it, are going out of the window. You add a layer of efficiency by simply pushing for a date. Decision-making is easier because there's a clear target, and any option that shifts that target deadline is simply not on the table. It's not a realistic option. And if you have less options, it's easier to make a decision. What I'm trying to say is, setting a timeline, even an unrealistic one, is a common management tactic to create focus in the team, and I think it's going to be very helpful moving forward. The rest of the interview is about Path of Exile 2 exclusively. Up next is class balance, build variety, and skill endgame viability. I will keep this short as Jonathan talks a lot, sometimes get into specifics but not for the most cases, plus it may not apply to your favorite build. What you can expect from patch 0.3 is a big balancing change, as they're going to think about each skill individually and the endgame viability of several skills. Let's tackle some of the crafting topics discussed. I feel in Soul Self-Found in particular, crafting is very impactful and a required game mechanic to progress. Straight up, Jonathan tells us that the incredibly low recombinator odds are intended and that it takes a grindy kind of person to use this thing. The reason why, I think, is because this system requires so many resources before you ultimately get a deterministic outcome. I don't use it at all personally. I would rather spend my expedition currency on the expedition vendors. I think in SSF that's a much more viable and casual friendly method. What I feel is interesting is that Jonathan mentions he doesn't want to bombard players with crafting systems, and as I am playing and progressing currently on a monk still in patch 0.2, I feel item progression in Soul Self-Found is really good already, and there are buffs on the way even in 0.2.1. I can definitely relate to the several progression stages Jonathan mentions, from the campaign where you just don't craft all that much, to early endgame where the focus is on crafting resistances and attribute gear, towards mid-endgame where you start dropping better and better loot, plus you gain levels granting you attributes, meaning you can get different affixes on gear with crafting, towards the ultimate endgame where they're introducing several chase crafting items with omens and socketables to really fine-tune and min-max your gear. What I'm trying to say is, for me personally, the progression loop since the initial loot buffs in patch 0.2 is in a good place, assuming you play a decent build of course. And on the topic of socketables, Jonathan does hint at making socketables or runes effectively unsocketable or retrievable, especially once super rare runes or talismans make it into the game, as players will be only slotting those in perfect gear otherwise if you can't take them out, which kind of defeats the purpose. I think in Soul Self-Found, players are more willing to simply spend currency as it has only one purpose, but his point is of course valid. For the considerable future, however, do not expect you can get these things back from your gear. It'll be something for the long run. Then Atlas progression. Jonathan discusses the tower system a bit more, says he can see why overlapping towers are good and not having overlapping towers feels bad. He also indicates that maps without league mechanics feel bad. It gets worse because up front, by looking at the atlas at the map you're about to run, you can see if your favorite league mechanic is on there. And if it isn't, that's more of a feels bad moment. However, in his typical Jonathan fashion, he is not willing to throw in the towel by changing the atlas or towers drastically, and is thinking about ways to make mapping itself more interesting. And he likes the exploration aspect of the atlas too. I agree with the latter, by the way. I think that's an amazing part of the endgame system. On a personal note, I would like to add that I feel the criticism of endgame and running maps is voiced in particular by Trade League map zoomers that are used to running their favorite map with everything in it every 2 minutes in Path of Exile 1. As an SSF player, I am not part of that group, although I could run 150 canyons in an afternoon myself in SSF in PoE 1, so I do see their point of view. I just think that in Path of Exile 2, especially in Solo Self-Found, there is less of that efficiency and more of the feeling of playing an immersive video game with great combat, fascinating art design and a sense of exploration and adventure. I think that's what they want to add to the standard grindy ARPG mix. I think this adds a bit of uniqueness to Path of Exile 2, and while it's not there yet, clearly, they must stick to these ideas and principles, and within this framework that they created, solve the current issues that endgame has. That means, I think, that the solutions likely won't look like players want, but I think that's also what makes Path of Exile 2 unique, and I love the game for all of those aspects as well. My latest Monk playthrough has been an absolute blast, and it's only 0.2 still. Finally, just random teasers Jonathan puts out throughout the interview, which I thought are worth mentioning. Attributes, they're high in terms of requirements. I'm struggling right now on that Monk with attributes, but it also adds balance. I can definitely see that balance argument. Jonathan, however, is willing to look at skill gem attribute requirements, meaning lowering them a bit, which I think is a great idea. Movement speed, Jonathan says maybe expect something on this front in 0.3, but base movement speed remains the same. More loot drops, apparently dropping an Instrumentis was 45,000 times rarer than dropping a Divine, which is just wild. So expect this to be less ridiculous in 0.2.1. I will link to Sir Gog's video who explains this aspect of the interview a lot better than I ever could, if you're interested in how drops work technically speaking. Acolyte of Chayula is getting some buffs, soon TM. And also soon TM div guards, which is potentially huge for Solo Self-Found of course. I have two more thoughts on the interview overall, a conclusion if you will. First, Talkative Tri's delivery and content creation style may not be everyone's cup of tea. I'm Dutch and we're known for being more on the rational side of things, together with the Scandinavians and Germans, and I'm more rational than your average Dutchie. I feel Americans on average are more expressive and enthusiastic and things tend to be amazing and awesome. I was in Los Angeles last year and the person with Tri's character or persona wouldn't even stand out too much. I understand there's more to the United States than just Los Angeles, but I think you can tell where I'm going with this, because I feel Tri, even in that US demeanor, which is on average more abundant, if you will, than your typical Northwestern European person would behave, is on the enthusiastic end of that spectrum. It's already higher on average, and then he, tops that line, tops that spectrum, if you will. So we don't mix all that well in how we make or view content, but I think the cultural context here shouldn't be disregarded. I know a lot of Americans are watching this video though, so let me know in the comments if I'm completely off here. You can flame me for this, but be nice to Talkative Tri. Be nice, because he did a great job here in this interview. It's clear to me he prepares his interviews really well, doesn't go into a bunch of random community questions which completely mess up the flow of a video like this, asks decent follow-up questions and doesn't seem that nervous. As an interviewer, I think he's doing a great job, and I think a much better job than most other content creators that also have these segments with Mark or Jonathan, but have a hard time making these interviews feel like a normal conversation. And as a result, they're very hard to watch. A pet peeve of mine is when PoE content creators start letting everyone know there's only a little bit of time left, but they still have a ton of questions from the community. And I'm like, how is that my problem? Why are you giving me this information? That's a bad thing to say out loud. All this does is create an uncomfortable situation for the devs, for the audience, and for the interviewer. Plus, it cannot be fixed. Jonathan's time is limited. Deal with it. Don't bother me or Jonathan with a situation only you are aware of and you have created. Don't make your poor time management my issue as a viewer. Don't start rushing because you want to cramp in all these questions and seem less and less interested in the answers. It's not a competition to see which content creator gets the most answers. It's a human interaction with one of the most brilliant minds in the gaming industry, and so many content creators squander the opportunity to have a genuine conversation with the GGG devs and make the audience part of that. I respect Tri a lot for really aiming at that human aspect of things, trying to keep all of this bullshit to a minimum. I know it's difficult to track the time, do an interview, listen to the answers, do follow-up questions, probably manage other stuff, but he's doing a great job. He makes the interview more relatable by talking about his dad, which I think adds a personal touch, and he keeps the interview from dissolving into a distracting, disjointed mess of random community questions. It's refreshing to see Tri be on the top of his game here. This interview has a bit of that rushed feeling in the end. I think that is something Tri can still improve on, but Tri also quickly understands he just has to wrap up the interview and even gives Jonathan the opportunity at the end for a final statement, which is very gracious and the correct thing to do rather than trying to squeeze in one more question. Overall, Tri made this a very pleasant interview to watch, and Jonathan had a good night's sleep, so that helps. So kudos for that. Second, to me, Jonathan as a game director and designer, just like Mark and Chris, are simply on another level compared to watching dev interviews from any other ARPG. Their understanding of their own game, of the genre, of the ARPG market and why certain games succeed or not, but also their understanding of the game's philosophy and having a clear vision and being able to express that vision, plus their understanding of players' gaming tendencies, creates this wonderful look into the mind of Jonathan, where he very eloquently explains why certain decisions are made, or goes into a random workshop/tangent on auto-targeting and from which body part that's calculated in different ARPGs, and you can see his gears in his brain are grinding. I think it's absolutely fascinating and unique to this video game. You may not agree with the vision or philosophy, and from time to time he doesn't understand the issue of players, but for the most part these interviews indicate they have a very good understanding of the player sentiments and community feedback. It's just that they sometimes disagree or don't have time or want to solve it differently. I think as a result, like we've seen so far, Path of Exile 2 and new patches can start out really rough, but over time, as the vision of GGG and the player expectations converge, it will be the next great ARPG to play, and it sets the bar that I don't think anyone can ever beat but GGG themselves in a decade or so. And that's the PoE interview summary. I'll try to keep you all up to date about these things and look at these updates from an SSF perspective, so if that interests you, consider liking the video or even subscribing. Thanks for watching, see you soon, love you all, bye bye.